Hey y'all, here's our next installment for our elective on nutrition and physical activity and fitness and their impacts on health. Today we're just going to go over some really basic concepts about why we even correlate physical activity with health. Part of what we're going to talk about is really even stepping back, why we associate physical movement, fitness, exercise, and all of these different terms and concepts with health. Right now, it feels like a foregone conclusion. Why wouldn't they be associated with health? And I think that what I want for us to think about here is to consider how all of these things became associated. So we'll talk a little bit about the public health element of this, and some of the cultural and economic shifts that have happened over the last century, and why physical activity had to be talked about because it wasn't just happening naturally. And also some other reframes in terms of our differing abilities around physical activity, how this changes over the course of the lifespan, how physical activity, exercise, and fitness become really limited when we talk about social dimensions of health, socioeconomics, and other issues of access. And also how on some level physical activity, fitness, exercise, our conversations around it, our cultural notions around it, and even our public health messaging, primary care, healthcare messaging around it can be harmful for some people. So let's dig in. All right, so what do we mean by physical activity? It's a really broad category. Really anything that involves moving your body. I'm even just me talking with my hands. Theoretically, that could be part of physical activity. But so that's more literal, right? What could be characterized as physical activity? I think of this as the larger umbrella under which we throw in things like exercise, and we throw in things like fitness and rehabilitation. So there's a lot of I think of physical activity as sort of our umbrella, and fitness being one of the things that fits underneath that, because not all things oriented, well, that's actually really challenging to say. Probably they could be couched under each other. Not all things that involve physical activity are necessarily oriented towards fitness, and not all things related to fitness are oriented towards physical activity. But for the most part, when we talk about this aspect of health, what we're looking at is that there's certain things that we do really specifically to orient our fitness, meaning maybe our extra level of skill or agility or literally like body composition. And generally speaking, that involves a lot of things around physical activity. Now, there's a whole other element of fitness that involves nutrition. So people who are, say, for instance, fitness competitors, part of what they use to define themselves as fit is not just simply their physique and their, percentage body fat or their strength, but also their level of nutrition, and also how that contributes to their physique and their body composition. But generally speaking, fitness has a much more specific connotation within the realm of physical activity. And we can throw everything in here: walking, biking, hiking, swimming, yoga, stretching, Pilates. So all the things, like the categories and things that we can sign up for, or dancing, are all under physical activity. So, part of why I asked the question, what is physical activity, is because this will automatically, for a lot of people, conjure up something about maybe running, or especially if we're talking about its pertinence to health, right? Physical activity and health. If we think about these two things together, it will conjure up something that usually involves some level of intensity, some level of regularity, and some level, so like some intervals and some level of duration. A lot of this, why we associate those things, comes out of some of the recommendations from even the American Heart Association, right? That the old recommendations back in like the 80s and 90s, not old, but older, were that, you had to exercise at least 30 minutes, 3 days a week. And that was important for heart health, really with the idea that it would not necessarily improve your health or improve your body composition, but that it was preventive in terms of experiencing a major cardiac event. So the idea is if you did a bare minimum of 30 minutes 3 times a week, you were potentially less likely to have a hemorrhagic stroke. or a major coronary event that would then, result in a heart attack, and either one of those things potentially resulting in your death. So it wasn't that 3 times a week, 30 minutes at a time was the only physical activity that we should do, but that it had a really specific role in our health, right? So then the other thing to think about is, what is our relationship between physical activity and health, and what is our goal? Because we can't really talk about like physical activity is healthy if we don't really know what our health goal is. If it's just not dying, how much physical activity do we need to do? For some people, well, the answer is 0, because we're all going to die. That would be the most correct answer. But if the person's health goal is, I just don't want to die of a stroke when I'm 60, that is a really different goal around physical activity and or fitness than someone who says, I would also not like to die of a heart attack or a stroke at 60. I would potentially like to avoid becoming a type 2 diabetic or an insulin-dependent diabetic. And I would also like to improve my mental health. Now you're talking about a very different level of physical activity, regularity of physical activity, intensity, duration, and also type in terms of other elements of our activities. Is it solo? Is it communal? Social? Is it oriented towards multiple types of physical development in terms of strength, flexibility, body composition, and metabolic, endocrine, meaning hormones, your endocrine system? Or is it strictly about weight maintenance? So understanding people's goals are a really important piece of understanding whether or not physical activity is necessary, really. Because you could do no physical activity, you'll still die, just like the rest of us. So it's not death preventive, right? So what's the goal beyond potentially living if you're talking to someone about the impacts of physical activity? And I think that this is a really, that means that this umbrella is very, very, very big, because the goals that people have for their health are very, very, very broad. And they are constantly going to change. So your goals we'll get a little bit more to the lifespan piece later, but your goals in your 20s and 30s are going to be really different than your goals in your 40s and 50s, either by choice or partly by force, by your own body's needs, but also your ability is going to change. Your access is going to change. Potentially your finances are going to change. Your time may certainly change depending on your career and or children or partnerships or commute or any of those things. So what falls under the context of physical activity and in terms of its impact on health really, really, really differs based on all of these things. Our time in our life, our health goals, and then also just all the different types of activities that are out there. Why do we associate it with health? Well, so like I said, the American Heart Association came up with those particular recommendations. But also what we started to notice that as people became more sedentary in their work, so, from the shift from agricultural society primarily to a more industrialized society, we saw people becoming much less physically active. Now, there were a lot of other health effects of being a more sedentary, industrialized society. Part of that was our exposure to the byproducts of industrialization, literally like pollutants. Living in more congested, densely populated settings like cities, moving from, less fresh air, outdoor work to indoor work in congested living and working conditions, and also working conditions that were very poor and not necessarily in a worker's control in the same way that they are slightly more so in an agricultural setting, obviously weather and, natural forces notwithstanding. But the reasons we associate it with health is primarily because of the ways that over the course of the 20th century, we studied physical activity and its effects on chronic health concerns. So now we are looking much more at things, chronic health concern prevention, but also things that we can do to improve our day-to-day health much younger. So a lot of the health associations around physical activity are what we call longitudinal. So the idea that if you do this thing now, you may or may not see the benefits. You might feel better, you might sleep better, you might, digest better. But really what we're trying to do is prevent and or improve your health 20, 40, 50 years down the line. not necessarily now. And I say this to you specifically as a group of people that might be chronologically on the, in younger adulthood, that a lot of the health information that's out there, like if you go onto PubMed, Cochrane database, is associated with preventing type 2 diabetes, preventing hypertension related to strokes, coronary events, even cancer prevention, and not necessarily oriented towards, well, how does this affect my life now? So much of our association of physical activity, exercise, and fitness is around longitudinal or long-term effects, and less so about effects here and now. Although that is very quickly changing in our current climate. So that's one of the associations. Why do we associate it with health? To prevent some of those big ticket items that we want to avoid if we can, but also come with a lot more suffering. One of the other reasons is also from a public health standpoint, that, when it was determined that, actually moving your body, it wasn't just our exposure to the byproducts of industrialization, geographically, location-wise, work conditions, pollutants, but it was also the shift in our work life, that we went from working physically with our bodies to sitting on factory lines, or then, 50s, 60s, 70s, sitting in offices, sitting in buses and trains, sitting in cars. Coming specifically post-World War II, as a lot of things that we've talked about in terms of nutrition, we've talked about in health policy, a lot of things changed for us culturally. And, I'm typically going to be speaking from the context of the United States, but this is many places worldwide, because then globalization continued out of industrialization in the 80s and 90s. A lot of these same health effects are being seen everywhere. That as we become more sedentary, we have noticed that people's health impacts have become more numerous in terms of increased level rates of cancer and more highly advanced cancers, more coronary events in terms of like heart attacks and other blockages, strokes, and type 2 diabetes. So a lot of the big ticket items have been more associated as we go through it. And so from a public health standpoint, they've been able to say, well, here's something that you can do as healthcare providers, as people who are counseling people in healthcare settings, that if you can encourage people to move their bodies a certain, at all, really, but a certain amount of times a week for a certain amount of days with a certain level of intensity, they can avoid some of these things. So a lot of this is based in some of the observations. A lot of this is based in the research that was done, and a lot of this is based in the public health messaging, with the idea that we are addressing population health, not necessarily individual health. And I say this because it's really important for us to understand that when we talk about physical activity, exercise, fitness, it equals better health, right? We all come up with our own picture of what that means. But generally speaking, it conjures up a certain image, again, what I mentioned before, of a certain level of regularity, intensity, duration. Those messages are given to us primarily from like research, chronic health prevention, public health paradigms. They're not necessarily given to us by like our day-to-day living, joy in our life, therefore potentially better health in our life kind of perspective. And I want to pick on that a little bit, right? Because this also comes back to like, what do we define as health? And for many of you in reading, your very first reflections, you shared that one of the things that that you characterized as health wasn't just eating healthy foods and moving your body and sleeping and hydrating yourselves, but many of you shared that being in, experiencing joy, experiencing happiness, living a life that is somewhat fulfilled or goal-oriented, or that includes, some of, where you are on your path towards your goals, even if you're not experiencing a ton of joy in the moment, that you're working towards something, this sort of the joy in knowing that you are on that path. And your mental emotional well-being as a huge component of your health. And yet we don't really talk about how physical activity, fitness, exercise impacts those things, which people say, and this is true in clinical practice, my patients say, this is really important to me. So think about the contrast in the messaging around physical activity, fitness, and exercise. That there's a very specific, people study very specific activities and their contribution to cancer, heart disease, diabetes. They're not necessarily talking about like, well, how much yoga would you have to do to experience joy today? That's not studied, right? Because that stuff is individual. So a lot of our messaging around exercise fitness is from a population health, public health, expensive chronic health prevention, not death prevention, but chronic health prevention standpoint. Not necessarily around what is healthy physical activity for you. What can you do today? What should you do today? And what qualifies as physical activity, fitness, or exercise that is healthy for you? Now, if you look at it from that perspective, the world is wide open. Laying on your floor, on your carpet, and doing, quote unquote, snow angels could be healthy for you, right? Would you ever characterize that as physical activity or fitness or exercise? No, most people would probably be like, I got my workout today. I did carpet snow angels. Most people aren't going to say that, right? But think about it in terms of your contribution to your health. If you are, and I'm making this totally ridiculous on purpose, if you're just laying on your floor doing a really soothing, repetitive activity, what else could be happening? You're slowing down your nervous system. You're laying on the floor, so literally you're physically resting your body, resting your spine, your neck. I don't know about you, but I sit at this computer too many hours per week, and that impacts my physical well-being and my health. Think even for a moment, this very ridiculous activity, it is physical activity. You are doing a physically active thing, right? But most of us wouldn't think of it as being exercise or fitness or healthy. But it actually could have very real and actually quite able to be experienced health effects in terms of what it does to reset your nervous system. So part of why I'm picking at this a little bit is that we associate physical activity with health, but with really specific health outcomes that we are ultimately trying to avoid, and looking at what kinds of physical activity will get us there. But when we do that, we make those really specific connections. What happens is that we leave out all these other things. And why it matters whether we leave them out or not is because we also then leave lots of people out. We leave lots of activities out. And we leave lots of definitions of health out when we make a very, very small connection between this type of activity and this type of health outcome. And we leave all these other things untouched, unmentioned, and really on some level designated as being somewhat unimportant. The other piece is we also don't necessarily talk about the unhealthy stuff because we have such a strong pathway and connection between physical activity, fitness, exercise, and chronic health prevention. We don't often also talk about on the other side, what also gets left out is what is unhealthy about physical activity. Now, many of you may have engaged in this. Many of you may know people who do. Many of you may feel that there's people in your lives who get to a point where this is unhealthy. And this is what I want to kind of pick on this a little bit too. So if you, as a person, commit to moving your body every single day in some way, it's Wednesday. Today you decided to turn on some music and you danced. Tomorrow you're going to go for a walk in the trees. Friday you're going to do carpet snow angels and jumping jacks. All free activities. You moved your body every single day. Was what you did healthy? Did it contribute to your health? Well, you can make the argument that yes, it didn't cost you any money. It cost you your time, but you didn't have to go anywhere to do it. You could do it right where you were. Assuming, you weren't feeling silly or ridiculous about it, but theoretically, they were free. You didn't have to go anywhere. You didn't have to, all you needed was your body and some space. And you moved your body every single day. And they made you feel, because they were silly maybe, made you feel happy and you smiled. Did you do something that was healthy for yourself? I'm to say yes, because we also know from a physiologic perspective that those things that help reset and retune our nervous system actually have very, very measurable impacts on our metabolism, on our endocrine or hormonal system, on our sleep, on our digestion. And we actually know that some of those lower impact activities actually do help with bone density and balance and long-term agility. They might not have the same impacts on cancer, cardiovascular disease, strokes, all those sorts of things that we know about or that we measure, but they do affect our health. And because we have very specific elements of physical activity, fitness, and exercise that are correlated with health, that sometimes we can overdo some of those activities, specifically thinking about like running, cardio, what we call cardio, so like steady state cardio, running for 30 minutes, elliptical or Stairmaster for 30 minutes, lifting weights. And now, right now, people talking a lot about lifting heavy. Is it possible to overdo some of these things? Is it possible to overcommit to some of those things? And maybe we don't end up having a stroke, but we end up creating some of these other activities. Or could we actually worsen our health in some ways because we also don't measure that? There are times where we can engage in physical activity, exercise, fitness, and definitely find ourselves in a state that may be more quote unquote unhealthy, right? That are sort of, beyond our goals. Like I wanted to get here, but now I'm kind of almost like I ended up back here, feeling worse than I did before. I see this a lot clinically, kind of like in our conversation with nutrition. I see a lot of people who kind of take the more is better approach. Like if I just eat more kale, I'll be more healthy. If I just run more miles, I'll be more healthy. And everything in our lives is balance, right? It's just figuring out what the balance is. But there's a lot of judgment around this particular category of health. And what constitutes health has been defined, right, from a public health population standpoint. And some of the other things that you might do that really create great health don't get well studied and might feel really silly, but then also some of these activities that are correlated with health can be overdone and can definitely create unhealthy states of being. Additionally, some of these same activities can be utilized to punish our bodies, to control our bodies, for people to actually engage in sort of disordered thinking about their body or like body dysmorphia, and feeling like, well, if they just push their bodies hard enough, it will look a certain way, not unlike what we see with food as well. So there are definitely times where this way of thinking can also go in a very, sort of overpass all of those other chronic health conditions we're trying to avoid and end up kind of almost back at the beginning where we have potentially broken our bodies down enough that we may have actually caused harm. Does it happen often? I mean, I guess it depends on the context. I see it happen really often. I know that people who work in the fitness industry and personal training see it happen very often. And so it's really, a lot of this comes down to what are our goals? And is the physical activity that we are engaged in really actually commensurate with our goals? And are our goals themselves about controlling or hating the physicality that we have and have been given to make it into something that it's not, or might honestly never be? Or is it really oriented around joy, happiness, and day-to-day functionality and ability? In this whole discussion, it also means that when we prioritize something like physical activity, fitness, exercise, we characterize differently abled people potentially as being less healthy people. So just think about it from that perspective. Like your own definitions of what it is to be healthy may involve your body being a certain size or a certain level of muscle density or body composition or athleticism. And it might not actually involve a version of you that is differently abled, either because there was an event or an injury or an illness that actually changed the way that your body was able to function and move, or with age that, do you become less healthy because you walk more slowly? Are you less healthy because climbing the stairs gets you out of breath a little bit when you're in your 70s? Are you less healthy if you are playing basketball but seated in a wheelchair? I think that these are all things that, are good questions for us to ask ourselves about how do we characterize ourselves and then other people in terms of their health when they are differently abled? And how do we also talk to people about the conversation between physical activity, fitness and exercise, and different abilities? This is something that's really challenging about the physical or the fitness and the physical or the training industry, is that people are really working with a very, very specific definition of what it means to be healthy, and that definitely is ableist in almost all ways. There are obviously people within those industries who specialize in people who are differently abled, people who train folks who are in their 70s and 80s, folks who work with people who have who are amputees or who are in wheelchairs or who have prostheses. So there are lots of folks in fitness and exercise who have adapted the way that they train people based on their abilities. But generally speaking, a lot of what comes to mind and what we talk about in terms of health and physical fitness and activity is incredibly ableist in its nature. And that by default, a lot of that imagery, a lot of that conversation leaves a lot of people out as being able to be defined as healthy and have access to what we all have access to, or we might have access to as more able people. This certainly changes over the lifespan. And I think this is something that people wrestle with all the time, and seeing this, working with people, working with pediatrics and adolescents most of my professional career. And then through that time, obviously, going from my 20s into my mid 40s, working, living very close to my parents and caring for them over these last 10 years. And I mean, they're very healthy people, but, being close to them over these last 10 years and seeing how their abilities changed, and the abilities of a lot of their friends who are in their 80s has changed. It's fascinating how health is always having to be redefined. And one of the main things, again, with more able-bodied people, is that they put a lot of stock and weight in their physical ability to move, their agility as part of their definition of themselves in a lot of ways, but also definition of health, especially if they've been people who've been physically active before. And that diminishing physical ability is something that is on some level almost harder to take than other aspects of aging themselves. Not just because it feels bad to move more slowly, or like, I used to be able to do this thing, why can't I do this thing now? Or why does it take me 3 days to recover from a really hard workout? Why are my muscles sore for so much longer? Why do I have to stretch so much more now that I'm 44? God, those are all things that can definitely get a person down, or just, require a change of mindset. But also it really starts to help affect people's thinking about whether or not they're included in that definition of healthy and what we mean by that. So just thinking even for yourselves, like, how will this look different as you move from decade to decade? Will it? And how will you adjust what you do? Because I think this is the other thing, and where a lot of people get very, very frustrated about the recommendations around physical activity and fitness and their correlations to health. It's like, well, I can't do the same thing I did. Well, for some people, I can't do the same thing that I did 20 years ago. So does that mean that I'm not healthy, or that I don't get to prevent that health benefit? So there's also very little adjustment in our thinking for how all of our activities and the things that we prescribe for exercise and the things we think of that are as being related to fitness change from decade to decade and over the course of the lifespan, and that there isn't really it doesn't actually make any sense to have the same thing be true from the time that you're 15 to you're 75, and have that be the same parameters for like achieving health. And yet the way a lot of that information is put out in research and in public health messaging is that you just keep doing the same thing and you'll keep preventing the same stuff. But what we know and what we experience is that's not necessarily true. Oops. So a couple things for you to consider in terms of physical activity is whether or not, oops, hang on one second, sorry, I lost my app, there we go, okay. one of the things to consider is whether or not physical activity, by your definition, actually helps you achieve health, right? Because if your definition of health is your physicality being a certain way, and that changes, have you achieved health, or do you have to redefine it? Another thing to think about is how access really changes people's relationship to health. So many of the things that we talk about in public health and even in the realms of fitness involve having a lot of access to equipment or gyms or trainers or people who can counsel them on how to use those things for their body and their time in life. And what if we don't have that? So do they not have access to those health outcomes and to that preventive health care? Does that put them at higher risk for coronary artery disease and stroke and type 2 diabetes and cancer? Well, what we see from a social dimensions of health perspective is yes. Is the lack of access to physical activity or organized physical activity the only reason? No, certainly not. I mean, we see that socioeconomics, health insurance, health provider access, location, transportation, all of those cultural values around exercise are absolutely all pieces of how access interferes with that. But just even thinking about those examples that I gave all the way in the beginning of like, well, what if you go walk in the trees, or do carpet snow angels, or stretch in your house, or do jumping jacks and push-ups and things like that in your own home that are free? And ultimately, from that perspective, accessible to you. That's allowing, assuming that there's time and space even within, and safety even within your own home to do those things. Do you still get to be healthy? Do you still have access to health if you're doing those things? What we don't know is exactly that. We don't know that if someone engages in those things every single day, that they're still potentially or very likely to be as healthy as anyone who goes to the gym 4 times a week. Those are the kinds of things that we still need to know in terms of people's health and whether or not they're included in that definition of health, and whether what they have access to is included in that definition of physical activity and fitness. So part of this, this conversation is really just for us to broaden our thinking around health specifically and how physical activity is associated with it, and to broaden our definitions of physical activity, and to also broaden what we think of as achieving health through physical activity. That it's not just about preventing some of these chronic illnesses, which are also important, but it's also really about how do we feel, accomplished every single day? How do we contribute to literally, using it and not losing it every single day? And also really reframing for people that it still does matter. There are actual physiologic effects. We know this even about meditation. We know that even if people spend like 1 or 2 minutes a day meditating, that it actually has measurable effects on the nervous system. So it stands to reason that all of these activities, even if they don't necessarily change your body composition or burn a lot of calories, that's one very, very small definition of health. All of these activities still contribute. So if you're walking up and down your stairs, you're walking to your car, you're doing exercises in your home, it's still 0 minutes versus 5 minutes, right? That there's still potentially some measurable effect there. And while we might not think of those things as really being like majorly preventive for chronic health concerns, there are still absolutely health effects. And potentially positive health effects, most likely positive health effects if we're not overdoing it, if we are moving our bodies every day. Now, putting that in relationship to calories and, weight is a whole other ball of wax. And we'll talk a little bit more about physical activity and health at every size and body dysmorphia a little bit more next week. But I want to at least throw that piece in there too, that there is a major, major, major part of our definition of health that has a lot to do with size and weight. And that a lot of how people use physical activity, exercise, fitness is to make their bodies a certain size. And that if those activities don't make their bodies a certain size, they are not healthy. That doesn't even classify as fitness or exercise or physical activity. That doesn't even classify as being healthy. That is a whole other thing that I want you to sit with right now in this moment, is to think about for you, how much does your body size and your composition figure into your health and your definition of health? And how much does that figure into your viewpoint on your physical activity and what you characterize as healthy activity, healthy fitness, healthy exercise? And what do you characterize as being meaningless? Because no physical activity, if you really think about it, is meaningless. It all has a physiologic effect. But whether or not people think it matters has a lot to do with whether or not it changes the look of this thing. And that's a whole other ball of wax that isn't actually really about health. That's really about vanity and many other cultural and social messages that we still have yet to unpack. So I want you to consider that. And we'll dig a little bit more into HAES and physical activity and how we use fitness and exercise to manipulate a lot of our definitions of health, and how we are also simultaneously manipulated into thinking that only certain types of physical activity and only certain types of movements are healthy, specifically because we are prevailing with the belief that if they were changing our body, they're healthy. If they're not changing our body, maybe they're not healthy. So think about that. We'll talk more about it next time.